Well, good morning. Welcome back to our pilgrimage together through the summer of 2014, and today marks day 6 here at the Institute for Priestly Formation, as well as, of course, the church across the world celebrates the Feast of the Visitation of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Today at IPF, the seminarians are experiencing their first full day of silence on the 8-day retreat. And as the men are in silence for their first full day, tonight's conference at the retreat is just going to really encourage them to not only relax and let the Lord reveal himself to them in their prayer, but to be reminded that God beholds them at the beginning of their prayer time, and that God looks at them very differently than perhaps they look at themselves. Tonight at the conference, we'll take a look at St. Ignatius of Loyola's quote from the Spiritual Exercises, where Ignatius himself, before he would pray, and I quote from the exercises, says that he will pause for the space of an Our Father, a step or two before the place where he is to meditate or contemplate, to consider how it is that the Lord our God beholds us. Then he will make an act of reverence and humility, end quote. So the very first thing that Ignatius would do before he would pray is he would stop, just for the space of an Our Father, about 60 seconds, before he would actually begin his prayer. And he would consider how God beholds him. He would not consider if God beholds him, or try to get God's attention, or even take a look at his own self. But the very first thing that Ignatius does in his prayers, he considers how is it that God is looking at him. Ignatius is convinced theologically that God's already there. Ignatius is convinced that God is looking at him. And so Ignatius is going to stop looking at himself, and he's going to ask, he's going to consider what's in God's eyes for him tonight before he prays. Just really good news. I think a lot of times we look at ourselves very differently than the way that God looks at us. And so tonight, as we encourage the seminarians on retreat to stop and just let God look at you, like we should really do the same in our own lives as we pray. It's just really good news for us that God doesn't not look at us the way that we look at ourselves. In fact, in Deus Caritas Es, which is, of course, Pope Benedict XVI's great encyclical on love, in number 18, he reminds us that the only way that we're going to love our brothers and sisters is if we see them through the eyes of Christ. Likewise, you might say the only way that we can love ourselves is if we look at ourselves through the eyes of Christ, the eyes of God. And so how is it that God sees us? How is it that God beholds us? That's what Ignatius is getting at in the exercises, and that's an invitation for all of us. So what is in God's eyes as he sees us? I think a lot of times we see ourselves through the lens of our own pursuit of self-perfection, or we see ourselves through the lens of unmet expectations, or we see ourselves through the lens of our sinfulness, or our limitations, or our weakness, or we often don't see ourselves as we really are. We see ourselves through the perception of who we either want to be, think we should be, or fear that we are. And God does not look at us like that. God sees us through his eyes, not our own. So if you were at IPF today, we would encourage you to not look at yourself the way that you see yourself, but to see yourself as God sees you. So for your prayer today, I would encourage you to pray with Isaiah 43, 1-7. That's on the blog. Isaiah 43, 1-7. And just ask God to show you, what does he see when he sees you? Take courage. Be encouraged. Be not afraid. For when God sees you, he sees you through his eyes, not your own. And he sees you through eyes of love. God bless you.